Hi, I'm Jane, and I'm one of the guest lecturers here from the Philippines for JNU GTU. In this part of our lecture, we're going to talk about multicultural education. So, in this lecture, I would like you to achieve at least one of our objectives, which is for you to define on your own, okay, the meaning, of course, of multicultural education and identify the many facets and importance of multicultural education. So, first, a very big question: what is multicultural education? So, we're going to define it and we're going to chop these words so that you can understand clearly what it means. Let's start with the word multi. Isn't it when we say multi, it actually means much or many, right? And how about when it comes to culture? So when we say culture, it actually refers to the way of life, customs, belief, and language of various groups of people. So, multi, much or many, the way of life of the certain groups of people or different groups of people. And education, obviously, if a word ends in ION, most of the time these are actually certain process. So when we say education, it is the process of acquiring or facilitating learning and acquiring of knowledge, skills, values, and habits. So you can have something in mind when we say multicultural education. It is kind of like a process, but what kind of process is it? So, according to James Banks and his paper, when we say multicultural education, it is an ongoing process. What for? It is kind of like a process which helps the students with their values, of course, and it values, of course, their different student cultures and prepares them to thrive in a diverse world. Secondly, according to Banks, it seeks to create equal educational opportunities for all of the students, including those from different racial, ethnic, and social class group. So it is actually what schools implement to establish equitable educational opportunities for all of their students. Now, according to Paul Gorski, as of 2010, he said that multicultural education is a progressive approach for transforming education that holistically critiques and, of course, responds to discriminatory policies and practices in education. So when we say progressive, it is kind of like an ongoing process still, right? So you can see actually there are more definitions of multicultural education. These are just some of the top definitions which were given by Banks, the father of multicultural education, and Paul Gorski. Now, how or why did multicultural education start? So you can actually have an idea on why it started. It is actually an outgrowth of the ethnic studies and movement of the 1960s. It actually has a very deep historical roots in the African American ethnic studies movement that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century. So you can actually have an idea why it started during the time. So it was actually kind of like a movement which evolved because of the civil rights movement in the United States. And although it began with the African American community, it actually expanded to include other cultural groups who are actually subject to discrimination. And recently, as student populations have grown diverse in a certain area, multicultural approaches to education are increasingly being used in various schools all over the world. It's actually famous and is actually being used in various places because of the diversity of students or learners inside the classroom. Now, what are the goals of multicultural education? The first goal is to help all of the students to acquire the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to function efficiently in a pluralistic, democratic society. Let me say pluralistic, democratic society. It is actually a society where people of different social classes, religions, races, and others are living together peacefully. Another goal of multicultural education is to help students to interact, negotiate, and communicate with people from diverse groups in order to create a civic and moral community that works for the common good. That is according to Banks and Banks in his paper. So these two are actually the main goals of multicultural education. Now, Banks actually proposed the 5 dimensions of multicultural education. So you have seen earlier in the chart, there are actually 5 dimensions. So you have content integration. We also have knowledge construction process. The third one is prejudice reduction, followed by empowering school culture and social structure, and the equity pedagogy. So we're going to discuss these dimensions one by one. The first one is content integration. So when we say integration, it actually means like adding something into something, right? Therefore, you can understand that when we say content integration, it is actually the extent to which the teachers use examples and content from a variety of cultures and groups to illustrate key concepts, principles, generalizations, and theories in the subject area or discipline. So it is the infusion of ethnic and cultural content into a subject area. And according to Banks, it is actually just logical and not contrived when this dimension is, of course, implemented properly into the curriculum. So, usually, this is being implemented in social studies and the language arts. Now, in other words, content integration is the usage of resources and texts from various cultures as a teaching tool inside the classroom. Clear? So that is the first dimension of multicultural education. Second one is the knowledge construction process. The knowledge construction process describes the teaching activities that help the students to understand, investigate, and determine how the implicit cultural assumptions, frames of references, perspectives, and biases of researchers and textbooks influence the ways in which the knowledge is constructed. So you can see here, to make it clear, that usually inside the classroom there's a less teacher talk and more student talk. Why? Because it includes a changing in the ways in which teachers and students view and interact with the knowledge, helping them to become more of a knowledge producers and not just merely the consumers of knowledge which are produced by the others. So you can see teacher talks, teacher tells, and the students construct knowledge, of course, with what the teacher is facilitating, right? Okay, and for our third picture, you can see here, usually the teacher gives meaning, and what is the role of the learner? They are actually the one making meaning. So you can see that, I'll emphasize that the students view and interact with knowledge, helping them to become more of a knowledge producers and not merely the consumers of knowledge produced by others. So they're just not sponge absorbing all of the knowledge. If possible, they have to make meaning out of the knowledge or information that they have absorbed. So that is the knowledge construction process. Now let's move on to the third dimension, which is prejudice reduction. What is prejudice, by the way? When we say prejudice, it is actually a kind of like a prejudgment, right? We try to make a decision before becoming aware of the relevant facts that we actually have. And of course, usually, most of the time, it is something which is unfavorable. Now, according to Alport, it is a feeling of favorable and unfavorable feeling, of course, toward a person or a thing prior to or not based on actual experience. We actually have different kinds of prejudice. So, the first kind is prejudice when it comes to the gender, right, of the person. So, when, for instance, when it comes to a business or workplace, sometimes for some companies, the gender matters very much, right? So they have this kind of thinking that if she's a male, she's like this. If she's a female, she's like this. Okay. So prejudice when it comes to the race of the learner or the person, prejudice when it comes to their beliefs, their social class in the society. I actually experienced this one. So they believe that if you are actually of a lower class of person, usually they do not talk to you. I actually experienced this one in a certain kind of seminar. Okay. Until I started speaking in English, then they started also talking to me. So um, this kind of prejudice were actually very obvious in our society. Disability. So many people believe they actually pity some people with disability, but frankly speaking, most of them actually even are better than those people who do not have disability. Prejudice when it comes to the age. So sometimes some people believe that, for instance, learners who's older are sometimes having difficulty when it comes to learning a certain language compared to some learners who are younger than them. Well, that's wrong. I definitely believe that regardless of the age, your effort is very important if you really want to learn something new in your life, isn't it? And the next one is prejudice actually when it comes to the religion of the people. Okay, the sexuality of the certain person. And lastly, actually there are more. There's are just some kinds of prejudice, but these one are just some of the top kinds of prejudice in our society. Prejudice when it comes to the language being used by the person. So if the person uses English, right, or if the person uses another language, certainly, okay, and most of the time, prejudice is very obvious on how some people interact with that kind of person. So I actually observe most of these ones firsthand based on my experience in teaching. Now, to reduce this prejudice, okay, Banks' third dimension, the prejudice reduction, okay, seeks to help students to develop positive and democratic racial attitudes. So, because of the problems that we encounter, the different kinds of prejudice that we have, this dimension tends to reduce or lessen, okay, the prejudice of people in our society. Now, this one actually describes lessons and activities used by the teachers, of course, to help students develop the positive attitudes towards different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. So, that is actually the main goal of prejudice reduction. Now, according to Allport, how can we probably or possibly reduce the prejudice? He actually gave three suggestions. The first one, we can actually reduce the prejudice if the learners or people in a certain group are cooperative rather than competitive. So there is less competition. He pointed out that the lesser the competition, the lesser actually the prejudice is in that certain group. Another suggestion given by Alport is that if the learner's individual experience equal status in the certain group or society, therefore prejudice could probably be reduced. Thirdly, he suggested that the groups can actually reduce the prejudice if the contact is sanctioned by authorities such as parents, principals, and teachers. So when we say sanction, it's kind of like an approval by their society. So Alport said these are just some of the suggestions, okay, on how we can reduce prejudice. However, it's still up to you on other ways, okay, on how you can actually reduce prejudice in our society. Okay, so I hope that is clear. Next one. The fourth dimension is empowering school culture and social structure. Now, how can we do or how can we possibly achieve this one, right? Now, according to Banks, we can actually do it if we create a culture and organization of the school which are actually transformed inwards. Okay, so if it's transformed inwards, it enables the students from diverse racial, ethnic, and gender groups to experience quality, okay, and equal status. So, what he's trying to say here is that if you want to empower school culture and social structure, you have to include the total environment of the school. So, when we say total environment, of course, it involves the attitudes, the beliefs, action of the teachers, administrators, curriculum, assessment, teaching procedures, and styles and strategies used by the teachers. So it doesn't only include the teacher and learner. I'll repeat, it includes the total environment of the school to be reformed. So that is actually what Bang said in his explanation on how we can empower school culture and social structure. Remember, okay, as a teacher, we can actually use or remember the following so that we can empower more the school culture and social structure of our school. The first thing there, first suggestion is to become familiar, okay, with the your students' culture, of course. So if you're familiar with your students' culture, it would be easier for you to understand on why your learners act in that way. So I had experience handling Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino students in one class, and knowing about their culture helped me a lot to understand why they act that way and why they learn in that way and why they look at me in that way. So it really helped me a lot. It was a great help to me. Based on my experience and based on some studies, another way on how we can empower school culture and social structure is to have a cross-cultural experience if possible. So it's kind of like immersing yourself or submerging yourself into their culture if you can. The third one, of course, if we cannot travel or submerge ourselves or immerse ourselves in their society, one way is by means of reading multicultural literature. I love this one. Through reading novels or literary pieces from other country, I actually learn the culture or background of people in that society. For instance, okay, there is this book that I read, A Long Walk to Water. Okay, so based on that book, I also learned about the culture of children in southern Sudan. Okay, their how they view the boys and girls during the time, and other things. There are many literary pieces actually like this, helping you to understand the society and culture of the students based on those literary pieces. Another one is to put yourself in a different culture. It's quite similar actually to have a cross cultural experience. And just another suggestion, okay, if you can have friends from different racial group, it would actually, it's a kind of like submerging also yourself or immersing yourself into their society without traveling, of course, in their own country. Okay, so what he's trying to say here is in empowering school culture and social structure, the total environment and culture of the school must also be transformed so that the students from diverse ethnic and cultural groups will experience equal status in the culture and life of the school. Wow, it's kind of like too ideal, right? But actually, we can attain this one, okay, if we implement this one properly. The last dimension is equity pedagogy. So, when we say equity pedagogy, it actually kind of like exists when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievements of the students from diverse racial, cultural, socioeconomic, and language groups. Academic achievements, of course, can be attained when cooperative teaching activities are done. So, of course, who is cooperating? The teacher and the student as a joint learner. As Rodney King said, is actually one of his famous line. He's actually one of the American activists. Okay, can we all get along? Okay, so this is actually, I just want to say this one because in equity pedagogy, it's kind of like working together between the teacher and the learner, right? Okay, now these 5 dimensions are actually very important to learn and study so that we can implement them effectively in our curriculum, in our school environment as a whole. The 5 dimensions, if you're going to look at them, are actually highly interrelated with each other. And of course, it requires deliberate attention and focus. So, how can we do this one? The first thing is the teachers and administrators must attend to each of the 5 dimensions of multicultural education described. So, if possible, they have to learn this one so that they know, they have to learn it wholeheartedly so that they know how can they implement it effectively in their school as a whole. Second one, okay, teachers should use content from diverse groups when teaching concepts and skills, and of course, help students to understand how that knowledge in various disciplines is constructed. Very helpful, right? And thirdly, for the teacher to help students to develop positive interlanguage attitudes and behaviors. So, the last one, we can actually implement multicultural education effectively if we modify our teaching strategies so that the students from various ethnicity, various races and culture, and even various social class groups will experience equal education opportunities, right? So it's kind of like it doesn't look easy, but if we actually do this one, it's actually highly possible that we can have a multicultural education in our school and community. Now, this is actually my last question. Why multicultural education? Okay, I want you to answer that one. Okay, there are actually many reasons, right? It is because implementing multicultural education, as you know, benefits not only the individual students, but also the society as a whole. Okay, because based on researches, those who learn to appreciate and value the cultural diversity of their peers will surely grow up to be adults who likewise promote equality and justice. And of course, they believe that based on research also, multicultural education has long term benefits. Okay, so these are only some of the reasons and why multicultural education. In the second part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about the different approaches of multicultural education and the challenges faced by the teachers and how we can solve those challenges. Okay, thank you.